The wind howled across the high desert plains, dragging flecks of dust and brittle brush across the dry soil like ghosts refusing to be forgotten. The land stretched out in all directions, empty, golden brown, and quiet, save for the creaking of the wooden windmill beside the ranch house. Clint Morgan sat on the edge of his creaky front porch, oiling the butt of his Winchester with steady hands. Above him, clouds had begun gathering like slow-moving wolves, hinting at the rare promise of rain. He paid them no mind. Storms came and went out here, just like people. At 30, Clint carried the weariness of a man twice his age. His face was sun-hardened, his jaw lined with a beard that hadn't felt the scrape of a blade in days. His eyes, gray and clear, held a quiet sorrow that few had ever looked into, and fewer still had understood. Solitude wasn't just a way of life for him. It was a shield. One he'd chosen long ago. The house behind him was small, but solid. Built by his father, and reinforced by his own hands after the land war swept through and left ashes in its wake. He'd rebuilt alone, no brothers, no wife, no children. Just himself, the horses, and the empty whisper of what used to be. He rose from the chair and headed inside, boots echoing across the wooden planks. Inside, everything had a place. The kitchen was plain. Tinware, cast iron, a kettle blackened from years over fire. A single bed stood near the back wall, and above it, a faded photograph nailed to a rafter showed a man and woman standing on this very porch, arm in arm, with a younger Clint between them. The frame was cracked. The evening wore on. He made beans and biscuits, ate in silence, and listened to the fire pop in the hearth. Outside, the sky turned dark. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and long, like the growl of a waking beast. Clint stood by the window, watching as the first drops of rain kissed the parched earth. A rare storm. The air smelled of damp dust. He was almost ready for bed when it happened. A sharp metallic clatter echoed from the barn, quick, frantic, unmistakable. Clint froze. It wasn't the usual groan of wind against timber. Something, or someone, was in his barn. He grabbed his rifle and lit the oil lantern. Stepping into the rain, he moved with quiet urgency, boots splashing in the rising puddles. His long coat billowed with each gust as he crossed the yard. When he reached the barn door, he pressed his back to the frame and listened. Another sound, a shuffling, a muffled thud. With a breath, he pushed the door open, lantern first, rifle raised. The scent of wet hay and horse sweat hit him instantly. Inside, the horses were restless, ears twitching, eyes wide. Something had them spooked. He scanned the stalls one by one until his light fell on the farthest one. And there she was. His breath caught. In the shadows, a figure slumped against the stall gate. A girl, or rather a young woman, barefoot, mud-covered, soaked from head to toe. Her hands were bound with rope, the fibers digging into her wrists, and an old iron shackle clamped around one ankle, chained to the base of a feeding post. Clint stared, stunned. She was no older than 18, her skin sun-bronzed and marred with bruises. Her long black hair clung to her shoulders, matted with dirt and straw. Her dress, if it could still be called that, was torn, hanging in damp tatters. Her head was bowed, and she wasn't moving. Clint's heart thudded, a mix of shock and confusion. He lowered the rifle and stepped closer. The horses snorted, shifting nervously behind him. He knelt by her side, placing the lantern down. "Miss?" No answer. He reached out and touched her shoulder gently. She flinched hard, gasping, her eyes flying open in sheer terror. Clint stumbled back, hands raised. "Easy," he said quickly. "I'm not here to hurt you." Her eyes were fierce, dark, sharp, filled with panic and fury all at once. She didn't speak, she just stared, breathing hard through cracked lips, trembling. "I don't know who did this to you," Clint muttered, "but you're safe now." Still no reply. He looked at the chain. It was rusted, tight, the shackle digging into her ankle, skin raw beneath. Without another word, Clint stood and fetched his axe from the tool bench. She tensed, eyes widening as he returned with the blade. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he repeated. "Just need to get this off." He worked carefully, wedging the axe under the shackle, then using a hammer to loosen the bolt. It took time. She didn't move, just watched him with fierce eyes. Finally, the shackle gave way, falling to the dirt floor with a dull clang. Her wrists were next. He took out his hunting knife and cut the rope, wincing as he saw how deeply the fibers had bitten into her skin. "You're free," he said softly. But she didn't run. She didn't cry. She didn't even thank him. She just curled tighter into herself, as if the world had already taken everything, and she didn't trust the scraps it might offer back. Clint stood, unsure of what to do. The rain was pounding now, leaking through the roof, soaking the floor. She couldn't stay in here. He hesitated, then reached down and carefully lifted her into his arms. She was light, too light, all bones and bruises. She stiffened, but didn't fight him. The walk back to the house felt longer than usual. The storm was in full swing now, lightning cracking in the distance, wind whipping across the land. Clint kicked the door open and carried her inside, setting her gently on his bed. He grabbed a blanket, wrapped it around her shoulders and stoked the fire higher. "You warm up," he said, pulling a stool beside the bed. "I'll get some water." In the kitchen, he poured a cup and returned. She hadn't moved. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in every corner like she was waiting for something bad to happen. He handed her the water. She looked at it, then at him. "It's clean," he said. She took it, small sips, measured, controlled. He watched, feeling awkward. "Name's Clint," he said quietly. She said nothing. He sighed and leaned back. The rain beat against the windows. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled again. He didn't press her. He didn't ask what happened. He just sat there, watching the fire. The hours crawled. She eventually drifted into a fitful sleep, curled up like a frightened animal. Clint stayed in the chair, eyes heavy, heart unsettled. Who would do such a thing? Who had the cruelty to chain a girl in a barn like a piece of property? Why, he couldn't make sense of it. And yet, here she was. When morning came, the storm had passed. The land was drenched, the air thick with the scent of damp sage and wet soil. Clint stretched, bones aching, and looked at the bed. She was awake, watching him. Neither spoke. But something had changed in her eyes. The terror was still there, but it had dulled. Now there was only silence, and the first spark of guarded curiosity. Clint stood. "You can stay," he said, his voice low. "As long as you need." Still no words from her, but as he stepped toward the kitchen, he heard the soft rustle of the blanket shifting behind him. She hadn't run. She was still there. And in a world that had given both of them too many reasons to leave, that small choice said more than any word ever could. The morning sun stretched its golden fingers across the soaked earth, painting the ranch in a faint warmth that hadn't been felt in days. Rain had washed the dust from the wooden rails, soaked the troughs to the brim, and left the world outside the cabin smelling of life again. Clint stood by the porch, arms crossed, staring out at the quiet land. His boots were still damp from the night before, but he didn't mind. He wasn't thinking about the storm. He was thinking about her. Inside the house, it was silent. No creaking boards, no shift of footsteps, no voice. Not that he expected one. She hadn't spoken a word since he carried her in. Still, there was something different about the way she had looked at him this morning. Something unspoken but not empty. A shift. A crack in the ice. Clint turned and stepped inside. She was still wrapped in the wool blanket, still sitting on the edge of the bed like she hadn't moved all night. Her legs were tucked under her, arms crossed loosely, back straight, as if even in her rest she refused to show weakness. Her eyes darted toward him as he entered but didn't linger. He said nothing as he moved to the stove. The fire was nearly out, just a few stubborn coals glowing at the bottom of the cast-iron belly. He stoked it back to life with kindling and breath, the flame licking upward with a hiss. Coffee grounds went into the pot, and soon the scent of boiling bitterness filled the room. He set a tin cup on the small table and poured some of the brew into it. Then he reached for the biscuit tin, broke a few in half, and placed them beside the cup. He didn't look at her, didn't speak. Just placed the food near her feet on a clean cloth and returned to the chair across the room. A long moment passed. Then, with careful, deliberate movements, she reached out and took one of the biscuits. She didn't eat like a starving animal, didn't shove or tear. She broke it in half and chewed slowly. The coffee came next. Her hand shook as she lifted it, but she drank. Clint let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You don't gotta talk," he said softly. "But if you do, I'll listen." She didn't answer. A few hours later she stood. Clint instinctively moved from the doorway to give her space. She didn't go far, only to the window, where she watched the land with eyes that seemed to search for something long gone. She stayed there for minutes, then turned and went back to the bed, not meeting his eyes. The next day passed much the same. Clint worked the ranch, as he always did, fed the horses, checked the fences, mucked the stalls. But every so often, he'd glance toward the cabin, half expecting her to vanish like smoke. She never did. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Clint returned to find her not on the bed, but near the hearth, crouched by the fire with a stick in her hand, stirring the coals. She didn't look up, just kept stirring. "I'll make stew tonight," he said, hanging his hat on the wall. "Got some potatoes and dried elk left." Again, no answer, but she didn't retreat. He cooked in silence. She watched. Her eyes weren't angry anymore, just cautious, calculating. When he set 2 bowls on the table, she walked over and sat down across from him. They ate. Together. And just like that, something shifted again. That night, Clint slept in the chair. She took the bed. He didn't question it. In the days that followed, their silent routine became a rhythm. She would wake before dawn and sit by the window while he boiled water. He left food and she ate it. When he left to work, she stayed inside. When he came back, she was always there. Then, on the 4th morning, he found her outside. She stood near the corral, watching the horses. Barefoot still, her feet pressing into the cool mud. Her hair hanging damp over her shoulders from washing in the rain barrel. The horses neighed and moved restlessly, uncertain of her. Clint approached slowly. "You like horses?" She didn't answer, but she walked toward one, a chestnut mare named Willow, calm and without fear. The horse stomped, snorted, but didn't run. Ayanna raised her hand, let it hover over the mare's muzzle. After a breathless moment, the animal leaned forward and touched her fingers. Clint blinked. "That's something," he muttered. She didn't smile, but she stayed there for a long time, her hand brushing the animal's nose in slow, deliberate strokes. The next day, she helped carry water to the troughs. The day after that, she mucked the stalls while Clint worked the fence line. She didn't ask, didn't wait for permission. She just did it, and Clint, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel so alone on his own land. When the sun set, they shared a quiet meal. Still no words. But now there were glances, shared looks, a faint awareness of each other's presence that wasn't there before. They weren't just coexisting. They were becoming something else. Something harder to name. Later that week, Clint returned from town with supplies: salt, flour, a bit of coffee, and some dried apples. When he walked in, she was sweeping the floor with a handmade broom, her back to him. The fire crackled. The cabin smelled like simmering herbs. "I got you a new pair of boots," he said, setting a small box on the table. "Figured your feet could use 'em." She paused, but didn't turn. Then, quietly, almost too softly to hear, she said, "Thank you." Clint froze. It was the first word she had spoken, a whisper of a word, but it held more weight than anything else in the world. He turned, looking at her. She glanced over her shoulder, meeting his eyes. "You're welcome," he said. From that moment on, everything began to shift in earnest. The silences grew shorter, the gestures warmer. Ayanna began to speak in fragments, simple words at first, then more. Her voice was low, husky from disuse but strong. Clint never asked questions. He never pressed. But late at night, when the fire was low and the outside world seemed far away, she began to tell him things. Her name, Ayanna. Her tribe, Apache. Her story, taken in a raid. Sold more than once. Hurt in ways she didn't describe. The last man, the one who died in the barn, had beaten her when she wouldn't obey. She never expected to survive. Never expected kindness. Clint listened. And when she cried, he didn't touch her. Just sat close, so she wouldn't be alone in the dark. Spring turned to summer. The days grew longer. The land came alive. So did she. Ayanna began to laugh. A short, sharp thing at first, but then rich, full. She rode with Clint through the pasture, barefoot in the stirrups, hair wild in the wind. The horses trusted her. So did the land. One evening, as they sat by the stream, Clint handed her a book. "It's a primer," he said. "Figured maybe you'd want to learn." She held it carefully, as if it might crumble in her hands. "I never learned to read," she said quietly. "Then I'll teach you." Their fingers touched on the page. Neither pulled away. That night, she didn't sleep in the bed alone. She didn't speak when she curled up beside him on the floor, just pressed her forehead to his chest and closed her eyes. Clint lay awake for hours, heart thudding like thunder, unsure what to make of the world anymore. But he didn't move. He just let her stay. Let her breathe. Let her heal. And for the first time in all his years on that broken land, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to die alone after all. They had no promises, no plans. But they had each other. And in that quiet space between pain and peace, they found something neither had known in a long, long time. Hope. The sun rose blood orange on the eastern horizon, casting long shadows across the still wet prairie grass. Ayanna sat cross-legged on the porch, her fingers weaving small bits of dry willow into something that looked like the start of a basket. Clint watched her from behind the window, coffee in hand, admiring how her brow furrowed in quiet focus. She had been up since before him, moving like the wind, silent but sure, calm but wild. He stepped out, boots thudding lightly against the wood. She didn't look up, but acknowledged him with the faintest tilt of her head. He sat beside her, his cup steaming in the cool morning air. "You sleep all right?" he asked. She nodded once. "Your bed creaks less than the floor." He chuckled. "I'll take that as a compliment." Ayanna smirked, eyes still on the twigs in her lap. "You snore. Now that's just a lie." Her soft laughter caught him off guard. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was quiet, breathy, but real. Clint's chest warmed in places that had gone cold years ago. She finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. "I like it here." That hit him harder than he expected. "I like you here too," he said. They stayed on the porch for a while, watching the sunlight spill across the hills, turning sagebrush silver. The world felt distant, peaceful, almost suspended in time. But peace didn't last long in the Arizona territory. Clint saddled up later that morning. Supplies were running low. Flour, kerosene, salt. He needed to make a run to Cross Rock, the nearest town, 3 hours west. Ayanna offered to go with him, but he shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "Town folks, they ain't like me." She didn't argue, but her jaw tensed. Clint saw the flicker in her eyes. Fear masked by pride. She knew what waited out there, knew it better than he ever could. "I'll be back by sundown," he promised, adjusting his hat. "You lock the door. Don't open it for nobody but me." She nodded. But he could feel her worry chase him all the way to the gate. The ride to town was uneventful. The land stretched wide and flat, only broken by rocky ridges and dry creek beds. Clint rode in silence, his thoughts tangled. He didn't like leaving her alone, but he couldn't avoid town forever. People would start asking questions if he kept sending trade notes with strangers. Cross Rock hadn't changed. The church bell still hung crooked. The saloon leaned against itself like it had given up trying to stand proud. Clint hitched his horse near the general store and stepped inside. Old man Vickers stood behind the counter, glasses halfway down his nose. "Clint," he grunted, "you're late this month." "Storms," Clint replied, "needed drying out." Clint handed over a list and started gathering what he needed. While scooping sugar into a sack, he felt eyes on him. When he turned, he saw Reverend Callahan standing by the entrance, arms crossed, gaze sharp beneath a brimmed hat. The Reverend approached slowly. "Heard tell you've got company out at your ranch," Callahan said without greeting. "A girl." Clint didn't stop what he was doing. "I take care of strays sometimes. You know that." Stray's a dangerous word these days, especially if the stray don't belong on white man's land. Clint looked up, slow and steady. "She was chained up in my barn, Reverend. Beaten, left to die. I ain't about to throw someone like that to the dogs." "Charity's noble," the Reverend said, voice syrup thick. "But you keep her out there too long, folks will start wondering if it's charity or something else." Clint set the sugar down harder than needed. "You don't know me. I know the law, and the law don't look kindly on harboring fugitives. She ain't a fugitive. Maybe not now. But the law's fickle, Clint. Changes with every vote and every torch." Clint took his supplies, paid in silence, and left without another word. The weight of the Reverend's warning followed him all the way home. When he returned, Ayanna was chopping firewood behind the house. She paused when she saw his face. "What happened?" "Town's nosy," he muttered. "We'll be all right." Her expression said she didn't believe him. That night, Clint tossed in his bedroll, staring at the ceiling. Ayanna slept curled near the hearth, her breathing steady. He should have lied to the preacher, should have said nothing, but it was too late now. They knew. And Cross Rock wasn't the kind of place that let things go quietly. 2 days later, Sheriff Doyle showed up. Clint spotted the dust trail first, rising in the distance like smoke. He told Ayanna to go inside. She didn't argue. She vanished like mist behind the door. The sheriff dismounted slowly, adjusting his belt as he approached. He was young, younger than Clint, with a badge too big for his chest and eyes that looked tired. "Clint," Doyle greeted. "Sheriff, you got a minute?" "Suppose I do." They stood under the porch awning, wind tugging at the hem of the sheriff's coat. "Folks are talking," Doyle began. "Preacher says you've got a girl out here. Apache." Clint didn't flinch. "I do. Damn it, Clint. She was chained in my barn, near dead. What would you have done?" "I'd have brought her in." "To what? A jail cell? A back alley where men spit at her?" "Hell no. You know I ain't like that." Clint stepped forward. "Then don't act like you are. I'm not hiding her. I'm giving her a home." "Town doesn't see it that way." "Then they're blind." Doyle sighed, pulling off his hat. "I'm not here to arrest you, not yet. But if they come out here looking for a reason and they find her—" "They won't." "They will. You know they will." Clint's jaw tightened. "Then I guess I better be ready." Doyle nodded once, slow and heavy. "Don't let this turn into something it don't have to." When the sheriff left, Clint went inside. Ayanna stood by the window, arms crossed, face pale. "I heard," she said. "They're not gonna take you," Clint said. "Not without a fight." She stepped forward. "I don't want to fight." "I don't either. But I'm not letting them hurt you." Her eyes filled with something he couldn't name. Not fear. Not sorrow. Something deeper. "They'll come," she said. "They always do. Then we'll be ready." That night, they sat by the fire in silence. Ayanna leaned her head on Clint's shoulder. He didn't speak. He just held her hand. Days passed. The tension didn't ease. Clint reinforced the barn doors, moved supplies to the cellar, taught Ayanna how to shoot his backup rifle. She was a fast learner. They stopped going to town. And then, one night, it happened. Clint woke to the sound of hooves. Lots of them. He grabbed his rifle, heart pounding, and peered out the window. Flames flickered in the distance. Torches. Maybe a dozen riders. Ayanna appeared behind him, pale and calm. "It's time," she whispered. He nodded. They barricaded the door, snuffed the fire, and loaded the rifles. Outside, the riders circled, calling Clint's name. Jed Crawley's voice echoed through the darkness. "We're here for the girl, Morgan. Hand her over, and no one gets hurt." Clint's answer was a bullet that shattered a torch from a rider's hand. The night exploded into gunfire and shouting. They fought like wolves cornered. The house shook under the assault. Clint fired from the window, Ayanna from the back door. They held off the first wave, but the second came faster. Then the barn went up in flames. Clint's breath caught. That barn was everything. His father's tools, the horses, memories. Ayanna screamed. The back door broke open. A shadow lunged. Clint tackled him to the ground. Grappling in the dirt, the rifle ripped away. He felt fists fire, pain. He struck back. Bones cracked, blood filled his mouth. Gunshots. Screams, smoke, then silence. When he opened his eyes, Ayanna knelt over him, sobbing, her hands pressed to his chest. He couldn't feel his legs, could barely breathe. "Don't die," she whispered. "Please." Clint tried to speak, but his lips wouldn't move. Darkness closed in, but he saw her face, saw her eyes, and he held on. For her, the light came slowly, like a reluctant promise after a long nightmare. Ayanna sat with her knees pressed to her chest, her back against the soot-stained cabin wall, eyes wide and sleepless as the first rays of dawn crawled across the floor. Smoke hung low in the air, clinging to the beams like grief. Outside, the barn was a blackened skeleton. Inside, everything smelled of ash, blood, and sweat. She hadn't moved from Clint's side in hours. He was still breathing. Shallow, ragged, but breathing. His face was bruised, one eye nearly swollen shut, blood crusted along his jaw and the side of his neck. She had bandaged his ribs the best she could, torn strips from the bedsheets and soaked them in whiskey to clean the wounds. His leg, his right leg, was mangled. The bone hadn't broken through the skin, but it was badly twisted, swollen, and darkening. Ayanna didn't know if it would ever work again. She sat frozen in the silence, fingers trembling. Her hands were streaked with soot and dried blood, her palms blistered from pulling him through the dirt after the fighting stopped. He hadn't woken since then, only groaned when she tried to move him. He was alive. That was all she could hold on to. The mob had fled just before sunrise. She didn't know why. Maybe they thought they'd done enough. Maybe they feared retribution. Maybe they were cowards. The only sounds now were the creak of smoldering timbers and the slow, labored rasp of Clint's breath. When she finally stood, her legs ached from crouching so long. She moved stiffly to the door and looked out over the land. What once was life had turned to ruin. The corral was broken, the water barrels smashed. 2 of the horses had escaped. The others were gone, scattered, or stolen. The barn was gutted, tools and saddles turned to twisted metal and soot. And the flag, Clint's father's old flag, had been torn down and trampled. She clenched her jaw, not to cry, but to keep from screaming. By midday, Clint stirred. A faint whisper slipped from his lips. "Ayanna." She dropped to his side, brushing his hair from his brow. His skin burned with fever. His eyes fluttered open, bloodshot and distant. "You're alive," she whispered. He blinked slowly. "Thought I lost you." "I'm still here." He reached for her hand, his grip weak but sure. "You save me?" She nodded. "Dragged you inside. Used everything I could find." His eyes welled. "I'm sorry. Should have protected you." "You did," she said firmly. "You stood between me and death. Now let me do the same." She brought him water, forced him to drink. Each swallow seemed to bring him back a little more. She crushed dried yarrow leaves for his fever and laid wet cloths across his forehead. When he drifted into restless sleep again, She cleaned what she could, sweeping out ashes, stacking the last of the unburned wood, salvaging food from the cellar. She found 1 jar of honey, 3 tins of beans, a small sack of oats. It would have to do. By the second day, Clint's fever broke, but he remained too weak to sit up. His leg had swollen to twice its size, the skin tight and red. She kept it elevated, pressed cold cloths against it, but the fear gnawed at her. If it worsened, if infection set in, she'd lose him anyway. On the third night, as the wind whistled through the broken window panes, he reached for her again. "They'll come back," he whispered. "We have to go." She held his face between her palms. "You can't ride. You can barely breathe. I won't let them take you." "They won't," she said, voice steel. "Not again." The next morning she loaded the wagon. It had survived the fire, parked just far enough from the barn. The wheels were intact, the axle unburned. She hitched their last horse, Midnight, the oldest and strongest, and patted the bed of the wagon with every blanket she could find. Then she gently, carefully lifted Clint into it. He groaned with pain but didn't protest. "We're going to the mountains," she told him, "to the healer." He blinked at her. "You know someone?" "My grandmother's sister. She lives up past Red Bluff. It'll take 2 days." He wanted to argue, but he couldn't. He knew he couldn't keep her safe from a bed. She packed water, herbs, bandages, food. Then they left, her at the reins, him lying behind her, teeth clenched with every jolt. They traveled slowly. The land shifted as they moved north, flatter first, then rougher. Trees thickened. The air cooled. Coyotes cried at night. She drove through wind and dust, eyes fixed ahead, never stopping for longer than it took to rest the horse and check his wounds. On the second night, Clint's fever spiked again. He trembled and sweated, whispering nonsense in his sleep. She sat beside him the entire night, soaking cloths in stream water, chanting low in her native tongue, a prayer her mother used to say. When they finally reached the narrow mountain trail, the wagon wheels caught in the ruts and threatened to snap. She unhitched the horse and walked him while Clint lay in the back, only half conscious. Her boots bled, her hands cracked, but she didn't stop. By dusk, a small wooden cabin appeared between the rocks and trees, smoke curling from its chimney. An old woman opened the door before Ayanna even knocked. Her eyes were clouded with age, but her face was strong. She looked at Ayanna for a long time, then nodded once. "You brought him far," the woman said. "I had to." "Bring him inside." They laid Clint on a bed of pine-needled straw, stripped him of his torn clothes, and bathed his wounds with warm cedar water. The woman packed his leg in paste made from crushed bark and fever root, then wrapped it tight in a linen bandage soaked with bear grease. For 2 days, Ayanna sat beside him as he fought the infection. Sometimes he screamed, sometimes he cried, sometimes he said her name so softly it broke her. But he lived. And on the 5th morning he opened his eyes fully. "Where?" he rasped. "You're safe," she whispered. "We're in the mountains. You saved me again." She leaned over him. "Always." He lifted a hand to her cheek. "I thought I'd never see you again." "You almost didn't." They stayed in the mountains for 3 weeks. Clint's strength returned slowly. He learned to use a crutch. His leg remained stiff, but the old woman, whom Ayanna called Auntie, said he would walk again, not ride, not run, but walk. Ayanna helped him each day, guiding him around the clearing, cooking over the fire, sleeping by his side. They didn't speak often. They didn't need to. One night, as the fire crackled and crickets hummed, Clint took her hand. "I was ready to die," he said quietly, "the night they came." "I know, but you gave me something to live for." Ayanna turned to him, eyes shining. "You gave me the same." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I love you." She didn't answer with words. She kissed him. Soft and slow and certain. And in that moment, in the stillness of the mountain air, with stars blinking above and the scent of pine all around, they made a silent promise. When they left the mountain, they wouldn't return to the world as it had been. They would build a new one. Together. The trail back to the ranch was quieter than the one that brought them away from it. The wind blew slower, as if mourning the path they had left behind. Clint leaned heavily on his crutch, one arm around Ayana's shoulder, his steps cautious but resolute. His leg ached with every movement, still stiff, but no longer useless. The fever was gone, and so was the shaking. His body had survived. His heart was still learning how to beat without the constant threat of it being torn open again. They rode most of the way in the wagon, stopping only when the horse grew tired or when Clint needed to rest. Ayana didn't complain. She never did. She held the reins like she held everything else in her life, with quiet strength and an unshakable gaze toward whatever was next. The land slowly changed from the high mountain air to the familiar hills of their valley. The sky opened wider, the trees thinned out, and soon the broken fence posts and the scorched remains of the barn came into view. They stopped at the ridge overlooking the ranch. Clint stared down at it, his breath caught somewhere between his ribs. Black scars still marked the ground where fire had eaten everything he'd built. The roof of the house sagged from storm damage. The fields were overgrown with weeds. It looked nothing like the place he remembered. But Ayana didn't turn away. She reached over, took his hand in hers, and gave it a gentle squeeze. "This is home," she said. Clint looked at her, a slow, tired smile spreading across his lips. "Yeah," he murmured. "It is." They reached the house by dusk. The door hung crooked, creaking when Ayana pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The hearth was cold. The table was overturned. But the walls still stood, and so did the bed. And the floor still carried the echo of their footsteps. Ayana set about cleaning without a word. She opened the windows and let the light in. She swept the floors, chased the mice from the corners, patched the holes in the blankets. Clint tried to help but found himself more of a burden than a partner. His legs still didn't trust the ground, and his arms ached after every few minutes of lifting or hammering. He grumbled about it, cursed under his breath, but Ayana never made him feel small. She simply handed him a chair and said, "You watch, that's help enough." And so he did. He watched her rebuild the world one motion at a time. She gathered wood from the tree line, chopped it herself, stacked it under the awning. She repaired the chicken coop with scrapboards. She used the last of the linen to make curtains for the broken window. She pulled weeds from the garden and started planting again, seeds tucked into the soil like prayers. Clint watched her every evening as the sun went down behind her, painting her in gold. Her hands were strong, her back straight, her spirit unbent. She hadn't just survived. She had become something more, something rooted and alive and fierce in her beauty, and he loved her for it. One morning, weeks after their return, Clint stood beside her as they surveyed the charred remains of the barn. Only the lower walls had survived, blackened but intact. "We could tear it all down," Ayana said, wiping her brow. "Start fresh." Clint shook his head. "We build on what's left. Let it remember." They worked slowly. Ayana lifted what Clint couldn't. Clint directed what Ayana didn't know. Together they laid the foundation again. They gathered lumber from the trees. They reclaimed nails from the wreckage. They rebuilt the frame, beam by beam, muscle by muscle, day by day. The barn rose like a monument to what they had endured. At night, they would sit by the fire and talk, not always about what had happened, but about the future. They spoke of planting fruit trees, raising chickens again, getting new horses when they could afford them. They talked about painting the house, about digging a deeper well. They dreamed in fragments, in whispers, in hopeful breath, and sometimes they sat in silence and let their bodies speak for them. One quiet night, after a full day of labor, Clint stepped into the doorway of the barn, watching the moonlight spill across the dirt floor. Ayana stood by the far wall, tracing her hand along the beam they had raised together. Her hair fell in loose waves down her back. She turned as he approached, her eyes catching the light. He stopped in front of her, reached for her hands, and held them tightly. "I want to marry you," he said. She didn't speak right away. Then, in a voice like soft wind against pine, she whispered, "I thought you already had." Clint smiled. "Not yet. Not proper. Not out loud. I don't need papers or a preacher. I know, but I need you to know. I need the world to know." She nodded once. Then, "Say it." Clint took a breath, steady and sure. "I love you, Ayanna. I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life. I want to grow old with you. I want to build everything with you." Ayanna's eyes welled. Her voice trembled. "Then take me as I am, bruised, scarred, not always easy. I'll take every part." She wrapped her arms around him, pressing her forehead to his chest. "And I'll take you," she whispered, "broken leg and all." They married 3 days later. There was no church, no priest, no guests, just the two of them, standing in the field where wildflowers had begun to grow again. Clint wore his father's coat. Ayanna wore a dress she stitched herself, soft linen dyed with tea and trimmed with lace from an old handkerchief. They exchanged words spoken from the deepest places in their souls, and when they kissed, the wind carried their promise across the valley. Weeks turned to months. The ranch came alive again. The garden bore food. The chickens returned, first 2, then more, gifted by a quiet widow from town who remembered Clint's kindness. One of the wild colts wandered back and took to Ayanna like a shadow. Clint walked with a limp now, but he walked, he worked, he smiled. And every night, he held the woman who had saved him. One crisp morning in autumn, as the leaves turned gold and the sky stretched blue and cloudless, Ayanna took Clint's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. He froze. Then his eyes filled. A child. Their child. He kissed her forehead, then knelt slowly, pressing his ear to her belly. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The world had tried to break them, but they had planted themselves in the ashes, and they had grown together. In the scorched dust of the Wild West, where hate once rode on horseback and fire tried to erase all hope, a broken rancher and a hunted Apache woman dared to do the impossible. They chose love. Not the easy kind, but the kind built through pain, scars, and survival. Together, Clint and Ayanna proved that even the fiercest flames can't destroy what the heart is willing to rebuild. From ruin, they made a home. From silence, they wrote a story. And from ashes, they grew a family. If stories like this stir your soul, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us here on Wild West Love Chronicles. We bring you powerful tales of love, courage, and redemption straight from the untamed frontier. Subscribe now so you never miss the next unforgettable story of hearts forged in fire. Saddle up. More legends are riding your way.